Good evening, everyone. We will get started in just a few minutes. Welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Kennedy with Touchstone Foundation, and we are just about ready to get started with our parenting series for this evening, A Parent's Guide to Raising Resilient Youth with Dr. Tom Foley. Thank you all for being here. And at Touchstone Foundation, our mission is really focused on youth mental wellness. And with that focus on youth mental wellness and children's mental health, we know that children are integrally connected to their families and their parents. And in order for kids to be healthy and thriving in their mental health journey, we need to be able to support parents along the way. So that is our reason and purpose for this series about raising resilient youth, is to really support you as parents and caregivers, guardians, raising kids to be resilient and successful in their mental health and wellness. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Tom Foley. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Um, so again, just to kind of refresh everybody as to who I am. So again, my name is Tom Foley, and I'm a board certified child and adolescent psychiatrist who has been working with kids and families in central Pennsylvania for the past 16 years or so. And I'm excited and privileged to be here for this series. Just to kind of remind everybody about this series. So I'm going to take a minute to do that. Building on what Anna had already described. So the Touchstone Parenting Series is a parent's guide to raising resilient youth. And it's really, we've designed it to be a clear, hopeful, and practical resource for parents navigating today's increasingly complex world. And we know there's a lot of information out there, and there's often conflicting advice about parenting and children's mental health. And so therefore, the goal of the series is to help cut through the noise and offer guidance that's grounded in both research and real life experience in a way that feels usable and realistic for families. So throughout the series, the core ideas that we have throughout the series is going to be supporting family resilience and helping children adapt to challenges, strengthening emotional connection and co-regulation, building strong, healthy relationships within the family, and encouraging a growth mindset and learning through difficulty. Okay. At its core, the series is about helping parents feel more confident, less overwhelmed, and being better equipped to support their children. Not perfectly, but in ways that are meaningful and sustainable over time. We aim to keep the tone here grounded, compassionate, and practical because parenting is hard and you're not meant to do it alone. So I'm going to actually start off a little bit differently with tonight's talk by actually doing an exercise. And this exercise is called the urge and the pause. And this is going to relate to the topic for tonight. So hopefully it's helpful to kind of set the stage. So I want everyone to actually experience what we're going to be talking about, actually feel it, because this is the same process that our kids are going through all day long. Okay. So if everybody could take a moment, take a second to imagine, and everyone has these experiences, probably multiple times a day, but imagine that your phone buzzes in your pocket right now, or you see a notification light up on your device, or you suddenly just have the thought, I should just quickly check my phone or check something, some electronic device. So imagine that's happening and notice what's happening to your body. Just observe it. Don't act on it. Where do you feel it? You might feel it in your chest or your hands. You might even notice that your thoughts are speeding up. Now just silently label it in your mind. This is an urge. This is my brain thinking something might be there. Now take one slow breath in and out. Just sit with that feeling for a few seconds without doing anything about it. Now ask yourself, do I actually want to act on this, or am I okay letting it pass? So that right there, that space you just experienced, that's what we're going to be trying to build in our kids. Not eliminating the feeling, but helping them to learn they don't have to follow it. Okay, so with that, we're going to shift into tonight's topic, which hopefully everybody finds interesting because it's very relevant, very relevant and challenging from a parenting perspective today. So again, the topic is parenting in the shadow of AI and technology. Okay. So I want to start with something that most parents, I think, today are feeling, but maybe we're not always saying out loud, that there's this quiet sense that something has shifted in the world with the kids, that the kids today are more easily overwhelmed, more easily distracted, and somehow less able to sit with the things that are hard or challenging. And we hear this a lot. Many parents are asking, is this just how the kids are now, or are we missing something? What we want to offer today is the guidance and the message that your child's brain is not broken, and that your parenting is not failing. But the environment of our kids growing up, actually the environment that our kids are growing up within, is fundamentally different than anything we've seen before. And if we understand how it's shaping them, we can respond in a way that is calm, intentional, and actually effective. Most conversations about technology focus on screen time, but that's actually not the most important question. The more important question is, what is this doing to the brain over time? Because technology is not neutral. It's designed to capture attention, to keep attention, and to bring kids back again and again. These are the way the algorithms are set up, right? They're actually using our psychology for their purposes of trying to gather that attention and bring us back. So over time, something subtle happens. The brain starts learning and it starts thinking, this is where I go when I'm bored, when I'm stressed, and when I'm uncomfortable. And that's what we call habit reinforcement. So the key reframe for parents in this situation is that technology isn't just something kids use, it's something that's actually actively training them. And it's creating loops and patterns. So we're going to talk a little bit about that without getting too into the weeds from like a neurobiology perspective, but I think we have to talk about what we know, even if we just scratch the surface, okay? So let's talk about why this is so powerful. Many parents will say, why is it so hard for these kids to put this device down? And that's where dopamine comes in. And a lot of people, most people have heard of dopamine and the reinforcement system. And originally the research related to dopamine was focused on addiction. And interestingly, there's a big connection here in terms of the neural pathway within the brain. It's just a much more subtle form when we talk about these micro doses of dopamine throughout the day when kids or even adults, us, are actively engaging with our devices. So these platforms, social media, games, short videos, they're designed to give small, unpredictable rewards. So it could be a like, a quick message, a funny video, and the brain responds with dopamine, not just when you get the reward, but when you anticipate it. And we don't have to get into the details of this, but most people think, because of what we've heard over time, that dopamine is almost like a pleasure chemical, but it actually isn't. It's actually the chemical that comes before, and it actually causes anticipation. So you can have some event, eat a piece of chocolate, and you will have a surge of not just dopamine, but also endorphins, pleasure hormones that make you feel good. But the dopamine actually then, your body is learning to then anticipate something like that. So in your mind, you can actually cause a surge of dopamine just by thinking about chocolate after you've had it. And you can see how this can kind of spiral in a way that we'll talk about. But it's important to understand that. So think about when we think about dopamine, we think about anticipation. Okay. So this creates a setting, a situation for craving, checking, and repeating. Okay. So as we said, dopamine is one of the major neurotransmitters. It does a lot, right? So its core function is in things like learning, also identifying the extent to which a reward differs from expectations. It's involved in memory, attention, mood, cognition, and sleep. And this is all important when it comes to mental health, and we'll talk about why. So the proliferation of social media platforms has given rise to a distinct behavioral pattern. And you've heard these different catchphrases before, but the one that I found in recently reading about this topic in preparation for tonight's talk was dopamine scrolling. So this is actually talked about in the scientific literature over the past several years. And so they defined it as a habitual act of scrolling through social media in pursuit of novel, entertaining content. Okay, so something new. And again, we're wired this way. And this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective because when we were hunter-gatherers or we're looking for our next meal, the brain making sense of and learning when I go to the pond, I can find something to eat, right? Then that helps you because then you'll remember to go back to the pond again later on, right? So from a very basic level, it was helpful for us for many, many, many thousands of years evolutionarily. The question now is, and ultimately this is the whole point of today's discussion, is what's happening to our brains now that we are flooded with all of this, right? And so how is our brain kind of being overwhelmed by too much stimulation that's causing too much dopamine? So the behavior differs fundamentally from other forms of digital engagement, which is characterized by active seeking of entertaining content, rapid platform switching, so jumping from kind of subject to subject or from screen to screen as far as like, minimizing things and going to something else. And then they have to have a significant time investment. And recent research has actually shown that it indicates that over 1 billion people in 2020 spent an average of 3 to 4 hours scrolling through social media each day. And these were adults. But again, this is kind of our culture now, right? And so I think it's important that we understand how, again, this is affecting us from a brain perspective, if we're going to be, from a parenting perspective, try to help the kids. So the problem is that apps often use artificial intelligence to personalize the feeds that you're actually getting, making them highly habit forming. And it's actually similar to gambling. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So experts suggest that developing what they call a slow dopamine habit helps to balance the instant gratification of digital devices. So it's almost as if certain types of engagement or gratification is more intense. So it's almost like a heavier dose of dopamine as opposed to softer, lighter, what they call slow dopamine habits. One of the most important things to understand about our kids' behavior is that dopamine is not about pleasure, again, about anticipation, and it's the brain saying this might be rewarding, pay attention. That then creates an urge that says, do it now. But there's a key. There is this space between the urge and the action, like in the exercise that we started tonight off with. And when kids learn to pause in that space, that's where focus, self-control, and resilience are actually built. So a simple way to think about this, the apps function a lot like a slot machine for attention. And here's the important part. This is not a willpower issue, right? So when your child struggles to stop, it's not because they're weak, it's because they're interacting with something that is designed to be hard to stop. Okay, so we have to understand that, and we have to realize that, again, it's the way we're wired, and it's actually a mechanism that is trying to engage the brain. And if we can understand some level of that, it's actually the way we're wired, and it's reinforcing in this way, it helps us to be in a better place, I think, to understand where the kids are coming from and not see it as they're just bad or they're weak. Okay. So over time, this creates a default pathway or what I would think of it almost like a default coping strategy. All right. So imagine a child is bored. Their default is they use the phone if it's available, right? And it's very stimulating and very engaging and very pleasurable. So what happens is they use the phone and that reinforces, okay, I'm bored. Here's what I do when I'm bored, and I'm no longer bored. Or when they're stressed, they go to the phone. Or when they're uncomfortable, they go to the phone, right? And this is the exact opposite of what we want to be instilling in resilient kids. In resilient kids, we want them to feel like they're able to, on their own, kind of on their own power, be able to manage boredom, stress, feeling uncomfortable. And the more they default to the phone or some external event that basically distracts them from themselves, they're actually missing opportunities, right? So it's one thing if this happens one day, it's another thing if it happens over the course of 10 years, right? So it's important to remember, developmentally, kids are not little adults. They are constantly maturing and developing, and every year throughout a child's development is an opportunity. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of opportunities within those years for them to learn and to develop and to learn about emotionally, obviously academically at school, socially. And if they are removed from themselves in this way, let's say on a phone or on the internet, for excessive periods of time, they're missing those opportunities, and they're missing. It's much more powerful than just saying they're missing opportunities, because they're really missing the ability to learn, to regulate and socialize, and the other kind of the good things about life. So again, once the kids are into this kind of default pathway where that's kind of their go-to is the electronic device, um, the kids actually are less, it's more difficult or more challenging for them to tolerate discomfort. They have a harder time solving problems and, again, regulating their emotions. And this is often where parents feel like they get stuck, because they feel like if we just take away the phone, we remove the behavior, but we don't build the skill. So I would suggest that the shift should be, it's not just about removing screens, but you have to build alternatives, right? So structuring things for the kids to succeed is going to be something we're going to talk about as well tonight. So because the real goal overall is helping kids to learn what to do with discomfort when the phone isn't there. All right. Another major shift that we're seeing is in attention. So ability to focus and sustain attention. So kids today are growing up in an environment of constant notifications, rapid scrolling, constant switching from task to task. And the brain adapts. It becomes very good at short bursts of attention and seeking constant novelty, looking for the next thing. But then imagine how this affects what we're expecting from kids. Homework feels harder, reading feels harder, waiting feels harder, right? So this is what we are kind of seeing in a lot of kids today and have been for many years now. And there's a really important line for parents to keep in mind. Again, it's not that your child's brain is not broken, right? It's being trained for a different kind of attention, which means that focus is no longer something that we can assume. It's now a skill that we have to actively build. And there was a really interesting, I think it was, yeah, so there was an interesting article that people might be able to find online recently from the New York Times. It was just 2 weeks ago. The title was "There's a Good Reason You Can't Concentrate." And it was the man's last name was Newport. He's a professor, interestingly, of computer science at Georgetown. And I think he had written a book called Deep Work. And he talks a lot about this specifically in the article, about how today as a society, not just for kids, this topic of attention fragmentation and how challenging it is, and how all of our attention spans have been changed because of this kind of system. Okay. Um, Before we move on to the next kind of section, I just wanted to also say something I should have said before. There's the idea, the way I describe dopamine and the kind of that cycle is fairly simplistic, especially in like a real world scenario. I also want to say that there's some people talk about this and they talk about this in the literature too, where there's almost layering of dopamine. So before we get to the layering, one thing to think about when we talk about that cycle is that imagine a person who goes to the gym and they start off going to the gym, you know, they've never worked out before. They start going to the gym, they start to feel good about themselves, and they just go and they lift weights. And then let's imagine that, they see that people are on headphones. So then a month in, they decide, well, I'm gonna listen to music, or I'm gonna listen to, some video or something while I'm at the gym. Um, and then they realize a month later, you hear about these supplements, like certain caffeinated things that make you feel good. And so each additional dopaminergic or dopamine type of phenomenon or experience that you're adding or layering on top of your activity is actually then resetting your level of happiness. And what I mean by that is you were happy going to the gym, and you probably would have been just as happy over time going to the gym. But then it had to be, well, I got used to, I couldn't go to the gym without my headphones because I needed to do X, Y, and Z with the headphones. And then caffeine came into the picture. And again, dopamine in this way is actually resetting. It's like moving the goalpost in terms of what makes the person happy. And it's very similar with electronic devices. And you may be able to think about this, experiences from your own life, day to day, or over time, that are very similar. And kids will have this similar experience. And so what happens to a kid if when they come home from school and they are used to having a snack, getting on their computer or playing a video game or whatever the case may be, and then some event comes along, a day comes along where they can't have any of that. What's going to happen? They don't understand it, but they're going to be dysregulated. And it's because their goalpost is now 10 yards away, right? And we've removed it. We've kind of pulled it back. And so now all of a sudden their body doesn't know what to do. So again, this is like a complicated topic, but we can think about for each of us and for the kids how this has an impact on again everything from craving, anticipation, but even happiness. All right. So we're going to talk about one of the most overlooked pieces of all of this, which is sleep. Okay. So screens affect a variety of things, as we all know. So for kids, it can affect how late the kids stay up, how easily they fall asleep, and the quality of sleep that they get. And when sleep either reduces in quality or the amount of sleep that they're getting, attention during the day gets worse, emotional regulation gets worse, and mood is dramatically affected. And most of the time, the kids are more irritable during the day. This is one of the most common things that I'll talk to families about when I'm seeing them in the clinic. Sleep right off the bat, sleep before anything else often. And sometimes the entire appointment is solely on how to help the kid to get back into a good sleep pattern. Because again, if a child, if a parent, or if a child's on medicine, or if a parent comes to me asking about medicine, if they're not sleeping, medicine's not even shouldn't even be a consideration for helping them with their focus or emotional regulation until we get the sleep under control. It's so powerful. So the brain becomes even more drawn to, again, quick and easy stimulation. So there's this nasty loop, right? So the kids are dysregulated because they're having too much screen time. They're not getting enough sleep. The next day, they're, again, inattentive. They're frustrated when they get home from school because they couldn't focus all day long. They're falling asleep. They're irritable. They're arguing. And again, when a person is stressed and their kind of system is used to having that dopamine fix, the easy thing to do is to go back to that cycle, right? So it's this nasty cycle where the person, it's very hard for them to get out of that cycle if it goes unchecked and if there's not the structure put into place. And again, that's where the parenting comes in. And it is so much easier said than done, right? Because the parents, you guys are the ones on the front lines who are actually trying to then manage the situation and trying to handle the dysregulation in the moment. And sometimes it can be so incredibly hard to create that change in structure that actually causes the kids to be more upset. but sometimes it has to be done in order to fix the scenario or the situation. So again, if you can change nothing else, protect sleep, because it's so powerful, and it's one of the most powerful interventions that we have. So let's talk about where the emotional risk really lives. It's not just connection, it's actually comparison. And this is one of the real dangers with social media. And this is, I think, what a lot of people are talking about. Kids are constantly seeing, you know, the perfect life, right? Or idealized images, or peer feedback in real time, all the good things, right? So everybody online looks like they're doing fantastic. And what, the old saying of, comparison is the thief of joy. It is so true. It's the way we are wired, right? So envy is much more powerful than jealousy, right? And I think that social media breeds envy. And so, again, that social piece is really important. And again, because of the dopamine system. So validation becomes reinforcing, comparison becomes automatic, and over time, this can affect self-esteem, self-worth, it can drive anxiety, and then it can cause mood symptoms, if not depression, irritability. So again, the issue isn't the technology connects kids. The issue is what kind of connection. So if we're careful about what the kids are looking at or what they're seeing, that can be a very powerful intervention. And for many kids, it becomes comparison and validation cycles, which can be emotionally exhausting. Some kids are more sensitive to this than others. So, I'm going to say things like kids with anxiety, kids with depression, kids with ADHD, but don't even think about those terms. Think about a kid who's just emotionally sensitive. Think about a kid who tends to internalize their emotions. Think about a kid who is headstrong, or just, they just get stuck very often. It's very hard for them to shift gears. Think about a kiddo who has just significant mood fluctuations throughout the day compared to their peer group. Think about kids who have a great deal of difficulty with impulse control. These are really vulnerable kids for these kind of situations. And these are often the kids and families that I'll work with in the office. So again, these types of kiddos, they tend to be more affected by these dopamine loops, by the attention fragmentation that we talked about, and by the social feedback, whether it's the idea of feeling like you're missing out on living an idealized life, or getting being bullied online, getting negative feedback from other people. And again, we talk about this loop, right? So you feel bad, you go to the phone to feel better, you go online, maybe it messes up your sleep because you're on the phone too much. You're looking at social media, feeling bad about yourself. You feel worse. What do? By default, you go back to the thing that's causing that stimulation and making you feel good about yourself, or you think it makes you feel good, right? And in the moment, it does, probably to some degree, but it's a very fleeting moment. And over time, it drives this very powerful negative cycle. And unfortunately, the loop reinforces itself. So again, instead of thinking about what's wrong with my child, maybe we think about it as what loop might they be stuck in. All right, so we're going to pause here for a little break, a little exercise.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks, everyone. I just, as a parent of a 12-year-old, I find this very, very helpful and reassuring. And yes, it's challenging. So I want to just give a pause here and invite you to participate in this activity that may help to just ground ourselves and have a moment for a little relaxation. So this is called the 5-finger relaxation technique, and it's a grounding exercise. So I want to just invite you to close your eyes or gently, lower your eyelids, and you can let your hands rest in your lap. And then either using your right hand or your left hand, it doesn't matter which one, just bring your fingers down to touch the tip of your thumb. We're going to start with the index finger. So you're going to touch your index finger to your thumb. And as you do this, as you apply a little pressure, Think back to a time when your body felt some sort of healthy fatigue. You had a nice long walk, you had just engaged in some kind of exhilarating physical activity. Maybe it's that time at the gym that Dr. Foley was talking about. Imagine how good it felt to have spent all of your physical energy without overdoing it. Just a nice long walk, somehow you moved your body. And your body felt heavy and your muscles were smooth and motionless afterwards. Now I want you to bring your middle finger down to the tip of your thumb. And as you do, think about a time when you experienced a hug, some sort of loving physical touch. It may have been a hug or a tender arm placed around your shoulder. And just remember and think back to how good it felt to receive that warm and supportive touch from someone who's important to you. Maybe a hug with your child. And next, bring your finger down to touch your ring finger down to touch your thumb, the next finger down. And as you do this, maybe hear again the words of a sincere compliment you received, or maybe it was a compliment you gave, maybe a compliment you gave to your child. And you had exerted a special effort and you felt gratified that someone had taken the time to acknowledge your contribution. So maybe somebody, gave you that validation, that compliment back. And finally, bring down the tip of your little finger to your thumb like this. And as you do, imagine looking out over a beautiful outdoor vista, the view out over a garden, and you felt content and inspired by the majesty of nature. Just take a deep breath and appreciate the pause. And again, it could relate back to that pause and urge that we opened tonight's session with. You can do this anytime throughout your day, just putting a little pressure between a finger and a thumb and imagining one of those experiences. Turn it back over to Tom. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Anna. That was great. All right, so I'm going to cover one more topic before we talk about more positive things, because we talked about a lot of, the problems that we're facing right now. The one last thing that unfortunately is a pretty powerful problem and is newer, is artificial intelligence, right? So kids are not just choosing the content anymore. The content is actually choosing them. Algorithms are actually learning what keeps them engaged and what keeps them watching. And then the feed that they receive is more emotional, more intense, more attention-grabbing content. So this is not a neutral environment, right? It was more neutral 15 years ago. It's unfortunately morphed quite a bit over the years, and now with AI, it's a whole new evolving ball game that we as parents need to stay on top of. So again, it's an environment that's actively shaping behavior, and that's why it feels so hard today as a parent, because it's not really a level playing field in that way. So let's shift gears and talk about good news. Okay, so again, reframing things. Technology itself is not the enemy. It's not going anywhere. It actually can do positive things, right? It can do a lot of positive things. It can support connection, it can support creativity, it can support learning. The difference is going to be its, passive compulsive use versus active intentional use. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. So what the research shows is that even small changes, such as slightly reducing the amount of use, online use, slightly more firm or healthy boundaries, can have a dramatic impact on a child, or I would even argue a family's mood, sleep, anxiety. Therefore, all that improves, relationships are going to improve, and it will be a positive cycle that can be very positively affected. So again, the idea here is that it's not about perfection, because there's no such thing. It's really about interrupting the cycle, right? So identifying if the cycle is there, the impact it may be having, and then tweaking it, changing it. So if everything we've talked about so far is true, technology, that technology is shaping attention, habits, and emotional patterns, then the natural question becomes, what do we actually do as parents? So we want to make this very clear. Again, this is not about being perfect, and it's not about eliminating technology. It's about being intentional. So we want to walk you through some simple, practical ways to raise healthy tech habits in kids. Um, so first, we have to shift the conversation away from how much screen time to what kids are actually doing on screens, right? Because not all screen time is equal, as we know. There are forms of screen use that are actually helpful. There's, kids can be creative online. There's different learning platforms. They can connect with family members, distant family members. Like they're all very positive, potentially positive aspects um, of technology use for kids. And then there's the forms that are much more risky. And here we're talking about things like passive scrolling, rapid content, again, driving dopamine, and then the algorithm-driven feeds that are just pulling them in, learning what they're interested in, and then it's like a hook, and it's just reeling them in. It's so much harder for them to be disengaged from it. So the key takeaway here is that it's less about the screens versus no screens, and it's more about how those screens are being used, um, and talking with the kids about this, right? So educating them about all of this is going to be, this really powerful intervention. The second piece is boundaries, but in a way that feels doable. So not rigid, not perfect, but creating structure. So some general guidelines for younger kids: very minimal supervised use of screen time. For elementary age kids, the recommendation is maybe 30 to 90 minutes a day outside of schoolwork. Again, knowing what the kids are engaged in, and ideally that it's you know shows that are maybe productive, or something that they can report back to you, and you guys could lean to a conversation where you can actually help them to learn from what they were watching, even if it's an actual TV show, right? There's opportunity there for learning if they're talking with you about the shows. For adolescents, there's more flexibility, but still have to have those clear limits. And it's super important to try to engage with the kids at an early age when it comes to educating them about everything we're talking about, and what's healthy and what's not, so that when they're adolescents, they're not learning it then, because that's much, much harder for them, right? And because by nature, adolescents are more distant and trying to be more autonomous from their caregivers, from their parents, right? So trying to have those conversations with kids at that age might be much more difficult, in the sense that they're just thinking, well, you're just telling me what I can and can't do, and getting angry about it, which is again age appropriate. Um, so what matters even more than the total time on the screens are what we would call anchor points, right? So certain rules or guidelines: no screens before bed, no screens during meals, protected time for things like homework, rest, family connection. Um, the most important reframe is that consistency matters more than the exact number. So creating that structure, making a plan as a family, and then being consistent with that across the board. Okay. So kids do better with predictable structure than constantly changing the rules. It'll be much, much, much harder to implement any type of strategy at home if there's not consistency, or if things are changing. All right, so the third suggestion is the use of timers to support transitions. So in most homes for kids, a lot of conflict shows up with transitions. Transitions can be tough, and especially when we talk about screens, right? So getting on screens is easy, getting off screens is hard. And that's not a character issue, that's a brain issue, right? So instead of expecting kids to just stop what they're doing, especially when it comes to screen time, we have to actually support the transition, right? So having a timer if necessary. Even if you don't have a timer in your own mind, you give warnings: 5-minute warning, 2-minute warning. This will set them up so that they are more prepared for that transition, and in their minds, it'll make the transition much more doable and less likely to have an explosive outburst when the transition takes place. So the idea of using some type of timer, it allows their brain to prepare, to shift gradually over time, and then to adjust themselves emotionally. And over time, something really important happens through this process. They actually begin to learn self-regulation. So the mindset shift is something like, we're not just ending screen time, we're teaching kids how to come off it, and that's a skill. Okay. And then, all right, so staying involved. So staying involved as a caregiver. So the fourth recommendation is probably the most important, right? So this idea that supervision isn't just about restriction, it's about relationship, okay? So again, it's opportunity for relationship building, communication, and learning, all right? So when possible, watch something with them, with the kids. Sit near them if that helps. Stay curious, ask questions. That will actually bring you'll see it light kind of light up their eyes that you're interested in what they're interested in, because they may think that you weren't even paying attention, or that you would never be interested in their topic, in what their show was. Simple questions that you could ask would be like, what do you like about that show? What do you like about, who are your favorite characters in that show? How does the show make you feel? Um, and you can gently introduce awareness. So you can actually talk about like what's more of a real life situation versus something that's more curated or fantasy or made up or sci-fi or what have you. How people present themselves online, how to stay safe. These are all different kind of opportunities for talking about the content that they're watching. So again, the idea here is that connection is more protective than control. And if your child feels connected to you, they're much more likely to share, reflect, and to make better decisions over time. Okay, so next we have to look at what happens outside of screens, because if screens are the only engaging option, then kids will naturally and automatically default to them. So we intentionally build what we can call offline defaults, right? So these have to be things that are accessible, appealing, and part of daily life. So it could be outdoor play, sports, any type of movement or physical activities, creative activities, even boredom, right? So trying to present this and build this into the schedule is really powerful and really important and very healthy for the kids. And it's very protective for them as well. Um, and I want to kind of pause on that last one, the boredom, because again, boredom is not a problem, right? The kids will say it's a problem, right? But this is actually where they can be creative, problem solving, there can be emotional growth. All of these things actually begin in those down times when they're on their own and what they would describe as being bored, right? So another way to kind of reframe and summarize this point is that it's not just about removing screens, it's about replacing them with something meaningful and being tuned into what they're engaged in. And then the last point that I was going to make is that the piece that's often the hardest, but sometimes the most powerful, is actually modeling, right? So kids are actually watching how we use technology, not what we say, but what we do. And it really is powerful. So it's worth asking ourselves, are we checking our phones during conversations? Do we tolerate boredom ourselves? Do we protect our own focus time? Are we eating dinner with our phone there and checking it out, during meals instead of, being mindful, being in the moment and being engaging with our family members? Because this really is a great example of co-regulation, right? So our habits shape their habits. And this is actually good news because it means that small changes that we make can have a big impact. Okay, so when we put all this together, the goal again is not to raise kids who avoid technology. The goal is to raise kids who can tolerate boredom, can focus their attention, can manage their urges, and can use technology intentionally, because again, technology is not going away. But what we can do is help our kids to build the skills to live well to live well with technology. And this starts with, again, structure, connection, and the small and consistent choices that we make every day. So when we step back from all of this, again, the goal is not to raise kids who avoid tech. The goal is to raise kids who are not controlled by it. So again, they can tolerate boredom, focus their attention, manage their urges, and use technology intentionally. So again, big picture, tying it back to the series, this is all about family resilience, the ability to stay with hard things instead of escaping them. It's about co-regulation, where our kids learn calm and focus by watching how we show up in these moments. It's about relationships, where connection builds stronger than distraction, and where kids feel anchored enough to come back to us. And it's about growth mindset, helping our kids understand that that struggling to focus, feeling pulled toward distraction is not a failure, but really an opportunity for learning and for growth. And that's the work of building a skill that we're trying to incorporate here. And when we approach it that way, not with fear, but with intention, we're not just managing screen time, we're raising kids who can handle the world that they're growing up in. Um, so at the end of the day, our kids are growing up in a world that is constantly pulling their attention, rewarding quick hits, reinforcing habits of escape. And our job is to fight that, it is not to fight that world perfectly. It's to help our kids build the skills to live well within it. And that's where resilience is built, not by avoiding hard things, but by learning how to stay with them. Okay. And that was what I had.
Thank you
I'd
so
like
much, Dr. Foley. That was fantastic, super helpful, and like you said, very relevant today. We are going to open it up to Q&A. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A box. And we already have a question. So I'll just start off with the first question. Anne asks, do the guidelines and recommendations other than staying involved, differ for age groups like elementary, tweens, and teens? So do you adjust your recommendations based on age groups?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, yeah, everything should be modified based on kind of the kid's development. And sometimes it's not even by age. Really, it depends on the child and kind of where they're at developmentally. So I would say that the framework of all of those recommendations that I suggested stays the same. It's just that it needs to be tweaked to kind of where they are emotionally, socially, where they are developmentally.
Thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and put it in the question, the Q&A. I'll move on to the next question. How strict should I be with technology with my kids? You mentioned boundaries and, being consistent. Is there wiggle room there? How strict should I be?
Again, I don't think that there's any hard, fast rule to any of this. I think
Yeah.
that, in the practical world, everyone's doing the best they can, right? And so I think everyone has to kind of decide what their philosophy is within their own home. And then try to be, again, as consistent as possible as to what that structure looks like, what you think makes the most sense. I would just say that, some of those guidelines that we talked about are really important. So modeling is huge, and it is so hard to do, right? Because we are
Yes.
distracted ourselves. We are adults. We have other things going on in life, and we get in those dopamine loops too, right? That intermittent reinforcement. It is like gambling, right? I mean, I didn't touch on this, but the most powerful type of reinforcement is what they call intermittent. And that is exactly what happens when you go to play the slots or when you go fishing. The reason that people keep going back is because intermittently they get a hit, they get a reward. And that's what happens here. And so it is there's that in addition to the dopamine piece, right? So I think that, that happens to all of us. And I think it's important for us to be honest about that and how it affects us. And again, that's an individual choice for an adult, for a caregiver, for a couple, for anyone, the people that are running the home. And then as you're being honest about that for yourselves, then you think about, okay, based on what I know about, what the research says or what I've read in some good books, I'm going to implement these different strategies and see what you see. Sometimes it's amazing the change you can see in kids by implementing a small tweak to a plan that you have, structure that you have, in terms of limiting or monitoring or whatever the screen time. And it is incredible. And I would say that if you wanted to start one place for kids' mental health, the biggest, most powerful thing is the sleep piece, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't touch on this in too much detail, but because I think I just said, come up with a plan of not having screens within a certain before bedtime. But I would say, what I talk to families about in the office is you come up with a bedtime, right, that is reasonable, that a child needs to get a certain amount of sleep depending on the age of the child. An hour before you want them asleep, you start to wind them down. And that means they are totally disconnected. They are ideally in a room that is cool, that is dimly lit, where they have minimal stimulation. And again, this is hard to do because life is busy. So it's really hard to stick with a certain schedule. But that's the ideal so that the kids' brains are in a place to be able to try to wind down. And I'll tell you, that is the most powerful. I mean, I talk a lot about, physical activity and nutrition in the office too, but sleep is by far the most powerful when it comes to concentration, focus for the kids at school, and emotional regulation. And so again, as you can imagine, the screen piece plays in so
Yeah.
incredibly to the sleep piece.
Thank you so much. We have another question in the chat. What if kids balk at these alternative behaviors? So they seem to always want to do what feels good, and that might be the screens or the social media or whatever it is. So what are some suggestions for parents if the kids are just balking at that, like not wanting to do those offline activities?
Yeah. Um, Again, it depends on where the child is in the picture of things, right? Because usually my guess is that the questions come from the perspective of a child who's already had exposure to screen time, right? And in that case, they will default to the screen time because it is so rewarding and stimulating. And so it's harder to kind of sell those other things, right? The other healthier, low dopamine activities, dopaminergic activities or dopamine stimulating activities. And so that's where the structure and the modeling comes in for most kids, right? And for most kids, that will work. But you have to remember when you're implementing a new strategy for any child, any normal, typical child, and you're changing something at home, for the most part, especially if it's a kid who doesn't, you're creating this change because the kids don't necessarily buy into it or don't like it, it is very typical for the kids to resist and push back. I would say you should automatically assume it's going to be 2 weeks, 2 weeks of pain in a way, right? We're testing, pushing, testing the limits, pushing back, outbursts, whatever the case may be. The trick is you have to have a plan in advance that you and any other caregiver at home is able to agree to. And then you guys, no matter what, you make it your mission to stick with that plan, right? No deviating from it. There's no excuses. Because if you deviate, you have to reset the whole plan again. It's very, very hard, right? So the consistency. So again, have a plan, create the structure. In this case, we're talking about structure where we're allowing for all these fun activities. And in some cases, it may be useful that you actually reinforce the kids engaging in those activities, which may sound kind of crazy, right? Like you're going to give them some kind of reward for doing something healthy, right? Something small, some activity, having downtime, being able to spend 20 minutes in their room after school or at some point in the evening where it's just quiet time. Maybe they're reading or there's a couple other activities that they can do, and you have to reinforce that to try to drive that home. Again, that's very normal that kids will push back. And you may have to get creative and think about different ways to try to incentivize them. And that won't last forever, right? They'll start to, what's really interesting with with John Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, with the movement that's taking place, and when you hear his stories from schools and from parents. What's fascinating is that the adolescents actually afterwards say that they wanted the adults to take these things away. It was almost like they, on some level, like again, they were in the moment, like, I need it. I'm doing it. It feels good. I'm getting something from this. When you force them away from it, which may be very difficult to do, but once they're away from it, and then that baseline, that goalpost is reset, they're actually happier. And many times they're so insightful that they're able to say, this is better, you know, which is fascinating, and I think that we're going to see this trend where more and more schools, like they are adopting these no phone policies and things like that because they're seeing good results, which makes sense, right? The kids are actually able to focus and be more mindful in the classrooms, so they're healthier and their grades are better and what have you. So that was a very long-winded answer to that question. Sorry.
No, it's great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for asking questions. Um, we are going to preview what's coming up. And if you do have a question, we can come back to it and feel free to keep putting those questions in. So upcoming series and topics, what's next? We are going to Next month, we're going to talk about early support and proactive care. So some things that we can do as parents before things spiral. Dr. Foley, do you want to say anything more about this topic?
Um, yeah, I think that it's important to keep in mind that, when we talk about the mental health crisis nationally, um, a huge percentage of a huge under recognized percentage of kids who end up struggling with anxiety or depression, they end up struggling for way too long. So it's not recognized early
Yeah,
enough. And we
yeah,
know that that earlier intervention, and this makes perfect sense, right? The earlier you catch the issues or the concerns, the better, the more powerful the support and the treatment and the impact can be for those kids so that they don't struggle as long and the severity of whatever they're struggling with doesn't kind of escalate.
yeah.
So yeah, it'll be an interesting, good discussion, hopefully.
And I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier about the importance of sleep and good sleep routines as a way to really prevent the more, you know, the bigger issues that may arise from too much time spent and too much, attention in the world of screens and technology. So, yeah, just they'll be really exciting next month. That'll be our topic, and it'll be appropriate for all ages of kids as well. Prevention really focused. And then the following month, we will talk a little bit about the future of youth mental wellness, skills for an uncertain world. And I think this is going to be, again, for kids of all ages, young people, but we'll cover some bigger topics of emotional regulation and adaptability, persistence, and meaning. I know we've covered these topics a lot at Touchstone Foundation, and I think it's really helpful to provide some tools and resources for parents and caregivers to be able to use in everyday life. Um, so yeah, that'll be great. Dr. Foley, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Um, no, I think we covered a lot.
Great, thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we will be sending out just a short survey. We really would love to hear your feedback and let us know, if you have topics that you'd like to suggest or questions that you'd like us to cover. Please take a minute to share your experiences, and we really appreciate everyone for being here and hope that this has been a very helpful topic. I know it has been for me as well as a parent. I find this just very, very useful and practical for myself, and I hope you have too. So thanks again, Dr. Foley, for joining us, and thanks everyone for being here. Have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.